arrangement. The main goal of a ceasefire is to allow for important things to happen. For example, it can give time for peace talks to begin, or it can allow humanitarian aid like food and medicine to reach people who are trapped in the middle of the fighting. But just to be clear, a ceasefire is not the same as a peace treaty, which officially ends a war. Instead, it's really a fragile first step toward de-escalation and finding a more permanent solution to the conflict that caused the violence in the first place. The process of reaching a ceasefire is often very difficult and complex. It requires intense negotiation, usually with the help of outside countries or international organizations acting as mediators. These mediators help the warring parties communicate and agree on the terms. The terms have to be very specific. They need to state exactly when the fighting will stop and what actions are forbidden during the truce. For example, it might say that no more rockets can be fired and no troops can advance. Trust is a major issue here, since each side is often suspicious that the other will use the pause to rearm or gain a tactical advantage. That makes the agreement incredibly delicate. For a ceasefire to be successful, both sides have to commit to honoring it. However, even with the best intentions, these agreements can easily collapse. Sometimes a single gunshot or a missile launch can shatter the calm and restart the violence. That's why monitoring is so important. Often, neutral observers are sent to the conflict zone to watch and report on whether both sides are sticking to the agreement. If one side breaks the rules, it's called a violation. These violations can lead to a complete breakdown of the truce, pushing the parties back into open warfare and making future peace efforts even harder to achieve for everyone involved in the conflict. So in the context of the recent conflict between Israel and Iran, the ceasefire announced on June 23, 2025 represents a pretty critical moment. It's an attempt to pull two powerful regional adversaries back from the brink of a much larger and more devastating war. The agreement is a test of diplomacy and a measure of each side's willingness to choose negotiation over continued military action. The world is watching closely because the success or failure of this ceasefire will have enormous consequences, not just for the Middle East but for global stability, security, and even the international economy. It's definitely a moment filled with both hope for peace and fear in military exchanges. The fighting was intense and technologically advanced, involving sophisticated missile barrages, drone attacks, and targeted airstrikes on critical infrastructure, including sensitive military and nuclear sites. The war started with a series of escalatory moves that quickly spiraled out of control. It involved not just Israel and Iran, but also the United States, which has a major military presence in the region. The United States conducted its own airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, most notably targeting the Fordow site with powerful bunker-buster bombs. This action was aimed at crippling Iran's ability to enrich in the Middle East. This direct attack on a U.S. base, though it caused no casualties thanks to advance warnings, represented a significant moment in the conflict. It really demonstrated Iran's willingness to directly challenge American military assets in the region. For its part, Israel focused its military objectives on degrading Iran's long-range missile capabilities and targeting the infrastructure that supports them. Over the 12 days of fighting, Israeli cities experienced repeated missile alerts, with families rushing to bomb shelters. The constant threat of attack created a climate of fear and disruption across the country, showing the vulnerability of even a well-defended nation to modern missile warfare. The 12-day war was a stark reminder of how quickly a long-simmering regional rivalry can erupt into a full-scale, direct military clash. The conflict pushed the entire Middle East to the edge of a wider conflagration, with global powers watching with deep concern. The use of advanced weaponry and the direct targeting of strategic assets by all sides really underscored the high stakes involved. The war's end, marked by the fragile ceasefire, did not resolve the underlying issues. Instead, it left a tense and uncertain peace, with both Israel and Iran assessing their losses and planning to
Hello, my YouTube family. Today is very sad news. Iran attack for the United States of America airbase and full video watch. And this video all the details provide, attack details all provide, and missile and airbase all details provide this video. So please full video watch and send our feedback for the comment box and support this YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Thank you so much. Goodbye, guys.
All military operations. The deadline for Iran to stop its attacks was set for 4 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time on Tuesday, June 24, 2025. This meant that all missile launches, drone strikes, and other offensive actions originating from Iranian territory were mandated to end at that precise moment. The world watched as this critical deadline approached, really holding its breath to see if the first step toward peace would hold. Following Iran's compliance, Israel was given a 12-hour window before it was required to implement its side of the ceasefire. Israel's deadline to stop all its military actions was set for 1600 hours GMT on the same day. This 12-hour gap was a crucial and highly debated part of the agreement. It was intended to serve as a verification period. It gave the United States and other international observers time to confirm that Iran was indeed holding its fire. For Israel, this delay was a security measure, ensuring that it would not stop its own defensive and offensive operations until it was clear that the threat of incoming Iranian attacks had subsided. This structure really underscored the fragile nature of the truce from its very beginning. The logic behind this staggered approach was rooted in the deep-seated animosity and lack of direct communication between the two adversaries. Without a neutral buffer and a period for verification, neither side would have been willing to be the first to lay down its arms. The 12-hour delay was a diplomatic invention designed to overcome this stalemate. It placed the initial responsibility on Iran to demonstrate its commitment, while giving Israel a measure of security before it had to reciprocate. This timeline was communicated to both governments and was publicly announced, making the entire world a witness to its implementation and adding international pressure for both sides to comply. However, this carefully constructed timeline also created a period of extreme tension and vulnerability. During those 12 hours between Iran's deadline and Israel's, the situation remained on a knife's edge. Any perceived hostile action could be interpreted as a breach of the agreement, potentially nullifying the entire effort. The success of the ceasefire depended entirely on both nations adhering strictly to this schedule. The staggered deadlines were a testament to the creativity of the diplomats involved, but they also highlighted just how difficult it is to build even a temporary peace between enemies who fundamentally do not trust each other's intentions or actions. The fragile hope for peace was, well, shattered almost immediately. Services. One missile scored a direct hit on a reinforced bomb shelter in the city of Beersheba. This single strike reportedly killed 4 people who had been seeking safety inside. It was, honestly, a horrific turn of events, happening at the very moment the region was supposed to fall silent. This suggested a catastrophic failure of the ceasefire before it had even fully taken effect. In response to the reported attacks, Israel immediately accused Iran of a severe and deliberate violation of the agreement. The Israeli government released statements condemning the act as a sign of Iran's bad faith. They argued that Iran had never intended to honor the truce and had used the announcement of a ceasefire as a deceptive tactic. From Israel's perspective, the missile strike on Beersheba was undeniable proof that the Iranian regime could not be trusted. The Israeli military was placed back on its highest alert, and its leaders began contemplating a powerful retaliatory response for what they described as a deadly and cynical betrayal of the diplomatic efforts for peace. On the other side, Iran vehemently denied the accusations. Iranian state media quickly issued statements rejecting any involvement in the reported missile launches. They claimed that Iran had fully complied with the 4 o'clock GMT deadline and had not fired any missiles after that time. Iranian officials went further, calling the Israeli claims a pretext for continued aggression. They suggested that Israel was fabricating the incident to justify breaking the ceasefire itself and launching further attacks against Iran. This complete denial created a confusing and dangerous situation, with 2 completely opposite stories being told to the world. This clash of narratives plunged the region back into uncertainty. With Israel claiming a deadly violation and Iran claiming total innocence, the truth became, well, really difficult to ascertain for outside observers. the world was left to wonder what had really happened. Was it a deliberate final salvo from a hardline faction within Iran, meant to sabotage the peace? Was it a tragic mistake, or were the Israeli claims part of a calculated move? This moment of accusation and denial put the mediators in an incredibly difficult position, and pushed the newly brokered ceasefire to the absolute brink of collapse, with tensions soaring once again across the Middle East. As news of the alleged ceasefire violation spread, the reaction from the White House was swift and dramatic. U.S. President Donald Trump, who had personally announced the ceasefire just hours earlier, intervened with a powerful and direct message. He took to his social media platform Truth Social to address the escalating crisis. His primary concern appeared to be preventing an immediate and massive Israeli retaliation that could undo all the diplomatic work of the previous days. President Trump seemed convinced that the ceasefire, despite the reports, was still viable and needed to be protected at all costs from collapsing into renewed warfare. In a post written in his signature all-caps style, President Trump issued a stark warning aimed directly at Israel. He wrote, "Do not drop those bombs. If you do, it is a major violation." This message was a clear and public command to the Israeli leadership to stand down and not launch the retaliatory strikes they were reportedly preparing. He followed this by insisting that the ceasefire is in effect, attempting to impose his will on the chaotic situation. He even ordered Israeli planes, which were allegedly already in the air, to return to their bases. This was an extraordinary public intervention from an American president in the operational decisions of a key ally's military. President Trump's reaction revealed the immense pressure the United States was under to hold the fragile peace together. His administration had invested significant political capital in brokering the deal, and its immediate collapse would have been a major diplomatic failure. His public posts were an attempt to control the narrative and de-escalate the situation in real time. By publicly ordering Israel to halt its military response, he was trying to create a pause, a moment for tempers to cool, and for diplomats to figure out what had actually happened. He was essentially telling both sides that the United States, as the primary broker, would not allow the deal to fail so easily. This direct and unconventional approach had a significant impact on the crisis. It put the Israeli government in a very difficult position. On one hand, they felt they needed to respond to a deadly attack on their citizens. On the other hand, they were facing a direct public order from their most important ally to stand down. President Trump's intervention effectively froze the conflict for a few critical hours, preventing an immediate spiral back into all-out war. It bought precious time for diplomats to re-engage with both sides and try to salvage the ceasefire. President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who were instrumental in coordinating the U.S. strategy and engaging with international partners. A key figure in the direct negotiations was Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. He reportedly shuttled between capitals and spent countless hours on the phone with officials from all sides, piecing together the delicate framework of the agreement that eventually brought the fighting to a stop. From the Qatari side, the mediation was led at the highest levels of government. Qatar's Emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad, negotiations, helping to translate broad principles into a workable timeline and a set of specific commitments that both Israel and Iran could, at least initially, agree to. The Iranian position during the negotiations was complex and at times appeared contradictory. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was a central figure in communicating his country's stance to the world. Early in the process, he publicly denied that a formal ceasefire agreement was being negotiated. He stated that Iran would only stop its military actions if Israel ceased its attacks first, a position that reflected Iran's deep suspicion of any deal brokered by the United States. This public posturing was likely part of Iran's negotiation strategy, aimed at projecting strength and ensuring that any final agreement did not look like a surrender to its domestic audience. Together, these individuals formed the core group of negotiators who steered the region away from a wider war. Their work was a high-stakes balancing act, requiring them to manage the demands of their own governments, the military realities on the ground, and the deep-seated historical animosities between the warring parties. The ceasefire, however fragile, stands as a testament to their persistent and often difficult diplomatic efforts. They were the architects of the pause, the individuals who built the temporary bridge over a chasm of conflict-related areas. According to official figures released by the Iranian government, at least 610 people were killed during the 12 days of fighting. This number included civilians as well as military personnel. Heartbreakingly, Iranian officials also reported that among the dead were 13 children, a stark reminder of how armed conflict disproportionately affects the most vulnerable members of society. The loss of life was a painful blow to the country. Beyond the official government numbers, independent human rights organizations have suggested that the actual death toll inside Iran could be much higher. Some groups monitoring the conflict from afar have estimated that the number of fatalities could be as high as 1,000 people. This discrepancy is common in wartime, as it is often difficult to get accurate information from a conflict zone, and governments may not release the full details of casualties. The reports from these human rights groups paint an even grimmer picture of the suffering endured by the Iranian people during the intense bombing campaigns carried out over the 12 days of the war. In Israel, the human cost was also significant, though the number of fatalities was lower. The country was subjected to relentless missile and drone barrages from Iran. These attacks were designed to overwhelm Israel's sophisticated air defense systems, such as the Iron Dome. While many of the incoming projectiles were intercepted, some managed to get through. According to Israeli authorities, 28 people were killed in Israel as a result of these Iranian attacks in the days leading up to the ceasefire. Each death represented a family shattered and a community in mourning, as citizens across the country lived under the constant stress of sirens and the threat of incoming fire. The numbers of killed and wounded only tell part of the story of the war's human cost. On both sides, millions of people had their lives disrupted. In Israel, schools were closed, and daily life was punctuated by dashes to bomb shelters. In Iran, communities near targeted sites faced destruction and displacement. The psychological trauma of living through such an intense period of violence will likely affect people on both sides for years to come. The ceasefire may have paused the fighting, or a deliberate provocation from either side. The underlying issues that led to the war, Iran's nuclear ambitions and its regional influence, and Israel's determination to prevent both, have not been resolved by the temporary halt in fighting. The risks are not limited to a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. There is a serious threat of the conflict spilling over and destabilizing the wider region. In the days following the ceasefire announcement, drone attacks were reported against U.S. military bases in Iraq. These attacks are often carried out by proxy militias aligned with Iran. This shows that even if Iran itself holds its fire, its network of allies across the Middle East can continue to exert pressure and target Israeli or American interests. This proxy warfare adds another layer of complexity and danger, making it difficult to contain the conflict and hold any single party responsible for acts of aggression. A major point of concern remains the status of Iran's nuclear program. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the world's nuclear watchdog, is urgently seeking renewed access to Iran's nuclear sites. After the U.S. and Israeli strikes, it is crucial to verify the extent of the damage to facilities like Fordow and to assess what remains of Iran's ability to produce enriched uranium. Without proper international oversight, there will be constant suspicion and speculation about Iran's nuclear activities, which could easily become the trigger for a future conflict. The verification work of the IAEA is therefore essential for rebuilding any kind of long-term stability and transparency. In summary, the ceasefire is incredibly important because it stopped a war that was rapidly spiraling out of control. It pulled the entire region back from the brink of a catastrophic conflict. However, it is only a temporary solution. The path forward is filled with peril. For this fragile peace to last, it will require sustained diplomatic engagement from the United States, Qatar, and other world powers. It will demand restraint from both Israel and Iran. What happens next depends on whether the leaders of these nations. The world awoke on the morning of June 22, 2025, to news that felt both shocking and, well, grimly inevitable. The tenuous peace that had characterized the Middle East for months had been shattered by the roar of American bombers over Iranian skies. The United States, under the decisive and often unpredictable leadership of President Donald Trump, had launched a series of targeted airstrikes against Iran's most sensitive nuclear facilities. This dramatic escalation, codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer, did not occur in a vacuum. It was the explosive culmination of weeks of rapidly intensifying hostilities, a dangerous dance of provocation and retaliation that had drawn in the region's primary adversaries, Israel and Iran, pushing them to the brink of all-out war and pulling the United States directly into the fray. The preceding 12 days had been marked by a relentless exchange of fire. Iran, in a significant show of force, had launched hundreds of missiles toward Israel, a barrage that, while largely intercepted, still resulted in the tragic deaths of at least 4 Israeli civilians. Israel's response was swift and punishing, its own strikes targeting Iranian military assets with devastating precision. The situation reached a critical flashpoint when Iran targeted a U.S. military base in Qatar on June 23, an act of aggression that, despite an advance warning, crossed a red line for the Trump administration. This final provocation served as the catalyst for a direct American military intervention, a move that would reshape the geopolitical landscape in a matter of hours and leave the international community scrambling to understand its full implications. The strikes themselves were a demonstration of overwhelming American air power. Elite B-2 Spirit bombers, the crown jewels of the U.S. Air Force's strategic fleet, streaked through the night undetected, delivering a payload of powerful bunker-buster bombs. Their targets were the holy trinity of Iran's nuclear ambitions: the heavily fortified Fordow fuel enrichment plant, the sprawling Natanz enrichment complex, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. The operation was executed with clinical efficiency, and American officials were quick to report that all aircraft had returned to base safely with no U.S. casualties. The immediate aftermath was a storm of claims and counterclaims, as Washington and Tehran raced to control the narrative of what had just transpired under the cover of darkness. What followed was not a declaration of war but something far more ambiguous and modern: a limited, high-stakes military action designed to achieve a specific strategic objective without spiraling into a wider conflict. The strikes were immediately followed by a flurry of diplomatic activity, with President Trump announcing he had brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. This sudden pivot from military force to peacemaking left many observers with whiplash. The world now holds its breath, watching to see if this fragile truce will hold, or if Operation Midnight Hammer was merely the opening act of a much larger, more catastrophic confrontation. The dust has yet to settle over the bombed-out facilities, and the true cost of this conflict is only beginning to be calculated. The narrative projected by the White House in the hours following the strikes was one of unequivocal success and overwhelming victory. President Donald Trump, addressing the nation and the world, adopted a tone of resolute strength. He declared that Iran's nuclear program, a persistent thorn in the side of American foreign policy for decades, had been effectively neutralized. Iran will not be building bombs for a very long time, the president stated emphatically, framing the military action not as an act of war, but as a necessary step to ensure global security. He made it clear that the objective was not regime change, but the complete and total dismantlement of Tehran's capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, a goal he claimed had now been decisively achieved through force. This triumphant account was strongly echoed by key members of his administration and his closest international allies. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth provided more granular details, describing the operation as a textbook execution of modern military strategy. He spoke of the Fordow facility, buried deep beneath a mountain, as being totally inoperable, its reinforced structures having collapsed under what he poetically described as 10 million tons of rock. Across the Atlantic, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu joined the chorus of praise, thanking President Trump for a historic joint campaign. Netanyahu claimed the combined Israeli and American strikes had removed the Iranian nuclear threat and delivered the most devastating blow to Tehran's military infrastructure in half a century. The evidence presented to the public seemed to support this narrative of destruction. Satellite imagery, quickly declassified and released to the media, showed significant damage to the surface structures of the targeted Iranian sites. Analysts affiliated with pro-administration think tanks pointed to these images as definitive proof of the operation's success, highlighting the devastating impact on Iran's centrifuge enrichment capabilities. The message was clear and consistent. American and Israeli power had been projected with surgical precision, and the primary strategic objective, the crippling of Iran's nuclear ambitions, had been met. The administration presented a world made safer through a bold and decisive application of military might. President Trump also sought to immediately pivot from warrior to peacemaker, a dual role he has often cultivated. Just hours after the B-2 bombers had returned to their bases, he announced that he had personally brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, bringing a sudden halt to the escalating violence. This move was portrayed as the capstone of his strategy, a demonstration of overwhelming force followed by the establishment of a U.S.-enforced peace. He warned both sides to respect the truce, threatening further action if Iran attempted to rebuild its nuclear program or if Israel were to violate the terms of the agreement. The official story was one of a crisis averted and a new, more stable reality imposed upon the region. Beneath the confident surface of the White House's public pronouncements, a very different and far more troubling assessment was beginning to circulate within the hushed corridors of the American intelligence apparatus. Leaks began to emerge from a preliminary classified report compiled by the Defense Intelligence Agency, painting a picture of the strike's effectiveness that starkly contradicted the president's triumphant narrative. This internal assessment, which quickly found its way to journalists at major news outlets, suggested that Operation Midnight Hammer was far from the decisive blow it was claimed to be. The DIA's initial analysis concluded that the attacks had set back Iran's nuclear program by a matter of months, perhaps less than 6, a far cry from the many years touted by the administration. The details of the DIA report were particularly concerning for those who had believed the official story. The intelligence analysts found that while the entrances to the heavily fortified underground facilities, particularly at Fordow, had been successfully sealed by the bunker buster bombs, the core structures deep within the mountain remained largely intact. The 10 million tons of rock that Secretary Hegseth claimed had collapsed the facility had, in reality, only blocked the doorways. More alarmingly, the report indicated that U.S. intelligence believed Iran had anticipated the strikes and had successfully moved a significant portion of its enriched uranium stockpile to other, unknown locations prior to the attack. The most valuable components of the program, it seemed, had not been destroyed at all. The public emergence of this dissenting view triggered an immediate and furious reaction from the White House. President Trump took to social media to denounce the leaks and the reporting on them as fake news, a deliberate attempt by elements within the deep state to undermine his foreign policy victory. The administration publicly and forcefully disputed the DIA's findings, insisting that their own battle damage assessments were the only accurate ones. The dispute created a jarring public spectacle, pitting the president and his political appointees against the nation's career intelligence professionals. This internal conflict escalated to the point where the Pentagon and the FBI launched a joint investigation to identify and prosecute the source of the leaks. The chasm between the political narrative and the intelligence assessment highlights a fundamental and recurring tension in modern warfare. The political need for a clear and decisive victory often clashes with the complex and nuanced reality on the ground. While satellite imagery could confirm visible damage to buildings, it could not reveal what was happening deep underground or what materials had been moved beforehand. The conflicting reports left the American public and international observers in a state of confusion. Was Iran's nuclear program truly obliterated, as the president claimed, or had the United States expended immense military capital for a setback that was merely temporary, leaving the core of the problem unresolved? On the other side of the conflict, the Iranian government was busy crafting its own carefully constructed narrative for both domestic and international consumption. In a remarkable display of political maneuvering, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian also declared a historic victory for his nation. His message was one of steadfast resilience and defiance in the face of overwhelming American military power. He portrayed Iran as a nation that had withstood the aggressor's best punch and remained standing, unbowed. President Pezeshkian